it's terrifying to me to see the potential that could have for increasing rates of suicide and self-harm.
One local therapist who specializes in treating people who identify as LGBT+ says she fears for the well-being of her clients and young people across the state should an Alabama bill be passed that would make it illegal to give gender medical care to young people who identify as trans. Sydney Stallworth brings us this week's Mental Health Monday.
I have a lot of patients who are expressing a lot of anxiety and fear, either about the possibility of not being able to start medical gender transition or about that being interrupted.
Dr. Sarah Mulder says Alabama's proposed Vulnerable Child Compassion and Protection Act has been a major concern in her sessions. The bill would essentially ban hormone therapy, puberty blockers, and gender-related surgery for transgender youth under the age of 19 by making it a felony to provide this care.
Dysphoria or the pain that comes from living in a body that's not congruent with one's gender identity is really acutely painful.
Republican Senator Shay Shelnut of Trustville, who sponsors the bill, says children aren't mature enough to make these decisions. But Dr. Mulder tells us that's not how it works.
You know, that's where therapists like myself come in, who are actively coordinating care with medical providers, as well as parents, caregivers, and families.
Medical professionals who give gender care could face up to 10 years in prison or even a fine of $15,000. The bill would also mean school staff and counselors are required to tell parents if a young person tells them they might identify as transgender.
Kids are going to get the message of, I can't talk to anyone about this. Suicidality are already at about 35 to 45%. The reality is that withholding medical treatment until the age of 19 or above is that a lot of kids are not going to make it to that age to receive that treatment.
The bill has passed the state Senate and is headed to the House. For more information and more Mental Health Monday stories, just go to rocketcitynow.com.